Alrighty. Well, thank you for everyone for coming out to today's Fair Housing Rights presentation. My name is Kenway Wong. We also have Kathleen Winter, who's part of GOAABA, and we're here to present together with Joseph Cordova from the Florida Legal Rights Association services to give us a presentation about fair housing education and rights, and as part of the Florida Legal Services Initiative. And so I just wanted to introduce everyone to Mr. Joseph Cordova, who's going to be taking it away for us. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to have this conversation. So what we're going to do is I have about 20 slides. I'm going to deliver about a 20-minute presentation, and then hopefully that will spark some questions, and we'll get into a discussion afterwards. And if you guys hear a doorbell sound, that's just other Zoom attendees joining. So without further ado, I'll move forward. So when we talk about fair housing rights, we're going to talk about why now. Okay, why is this such an important issue to talk about now? Well, it's not like discrimination and racism and hate crime is new, but why is it important now specific to housing? The Urban Institute's national studies of housing discrimination have documented differential treatment of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders compared with white Americans in rental and sales markets. And as you can see by these bullet points, this is just two very, very simple, short bullet points about how members of the AAPI community are shown fewer rental properties than white counterparts are, and they are shown fewer properties for sale than their white counterparts are. And this is all done via the active testing under the fair housing rights and programs throughout the country. So as you can see, just on the very, very basic, simple, level of discrimination, before they're even able to move in, members of the AAPI community are being discriminated against and denied housing because they're simply not even shown the equivalent number of rentals and housing. And from there, it goes on and on. Well, and why is it so specific to today, and what does this discrimination look like? So as we all know, in the last year and a half, we have COVID-based hate crimes where things like blame, xenophobic backlash, harassment, and violence have just been at an all-time high, directed at the AAPI community. And then, long-standing discrimination is based on the concept of the model minority, which is it assumes monolithic cultures. It minimizes the reality of racism. It creates unfair expectations and stereotypes. It creates a divide amongst other minority populations. And it puts into the mind of a lot of individuals that members of the AAPI community are perpetual foreigners, and it limits individual paths. So you have new hate crimes that have stemmed from COVID, and then you just have the long-lasting stereotypes that come with model minority. And I didn't even dedicate a bullet point to just general racism and discrimination, which happens all the time. So as you can see, when it comes to the modern day, discrimination, hate crimes, harassment is at an all-time high in this community. So what I like to kick things off with when we talk specific to fair housing are these little red flags that a lot of times families and individuals do not know to keep their eyes and ears out for. So if you're looking for a rental or you're looking to buy a house and you hear things like, sorry, we don't rent to families with children, or this apartment isn't going to work with your disability, or you need a social security number to rent here. Maybe you hear this neighborhood probably isn't the right fit for you. These days, you might hear things like, now just isn't a good time to be renting to people like you. Or I'd much rather have people like you than others, the reverse. Either way, any kind of phrasing like this is likely a violation of the Fair Housing Act, okay? Well, so what is the Fair Housing Act? The Federal Fair Housing Act, and by the way, Florida's Fair Housing Act is almost verbatim the same as the Federal Fair Housing Act. So when we talk about federal fair housing rights, for the most part, we're talking about an equivalent level of rights at the state level here in Florida. Now, when we get down to counties and smaller jurisdictions, You might actually be afforded more rights. As we all know, states and local government can always offer more rights, but they can't offer fewer rights than what federal legislation has already given. But the Federal Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination in housing-related transactions. We'll come back to that term. Because of race, color, religion, national origin, sex, disability, or familial status. So there are seven protected classes. And what does it protect against? It protects against disparate treatment, which is just the direct, overt discrimination in the moment, one-to-one, I am discriminating against you. It also protects against disparate impact, which I have a couple slides dedicated to towards the end. Disparate impact is the idea that you are, whether it's intentional or unintentional, but you're discriminating against an entire community or population of people with a policy that applies to everyone but only affects a few. And we'll talk more about that here a little bit later. So what is a housing transaction? A lot of times people think the Fair Housing Act really only relates to landlords and tenants, and that is not true at all. It relates to so many more relationships in the housing community. So it does relate to rent, and your rights are protected from the moment you begin looking for a place to rent. If it's 3 o'clock in the morning, you're having trouble sleeping and you're looking for an apartment, and you are on apartments.com or you are on some sort of listserv or online classifieds, and you see an ad that says this rental is perfect for a young couple without kids, you have been discriminated against, okay? And you can file a claim based on that advertisement. And the person who wrote that advertisement might say, what? I discriminated against somebody I've never even met? Yes, that's true, because your advertisement specified the type of people you would like to live there. So even simple things like great neighborhood close to a Catholic church, can't say that, okay? Because you've just said it's better for Catholics to live here than anybody else, okay? So when you're renting an apartment, your rights begin the moment you begin looking for rent, and those rights and protections continue all the way through the relationship. So anytime your rental is being maintained, or any policies or rules that relate to the lease that you must follow, your fair housing rights are still in play. It also relates to sales of homes, home mortgages, and lending. Anytime you get an appraisal, I'll share a quick story that some of you may have heard. I believe it was 3 months ago, I believe it was in Delaware. A woman had her home appraised as she was preparing it for sale. This was an African-American woman. And the appraiser came and he appraised it at around $125,000. And she thought that was low, especially considering that other homes around her, other comparable homes, were going for about $250,000. So she had another appraisal done, came back even lower, around $115,000. She was shocked. So she called a third time, but this time she had her friend who had a white husband, have her white husband come and stand in for her as the owner. He didn't introduce himself as the owner. He just simply opened the door and said, hello, come on in. And she took down all of her family photos and anything in her home that had any reflection that an African-American family lived there. The appraisal came back $250,000. Her home more than doubled in price simply because a white man answered the door. So you can see that fair housing applies even to the appraisals and preparation of selling a home. It also applies to home insurance, homeowners insurance, and homeowners association policies. And so who must follow these rules? Landlords, real estate agents, lenders, insurance companies, homeowners associations. I'm going to ask my first question to the group. What about other tenants? Does the Fair Housing Act protections and rights apply to other tenants as far as other tenants harassing you or discriminating against you? Any guesses? Or anyone just know? You don't have to guess. Okay, so technically another tenant harassing you, they're not denying you of housing. So they are not the ones who have a housing relationship with you. However, if you are being harassed and discriminated against by other tenants and you go and you complain to management and they don't do anything about it, the management is on the hook for the other tenant's harassment and discrimination against you. So if you complain, my next door neighbor, he leaves nasty signs on my door, or he's constantly using racial slurs to talk about me and my family, and management just kind of shrugs their shoulders and says, not my problem. Nope, it is their problem. And you can file a complaint against the housing manager or the apartment community management team because they did not stop the harassment that another tenant was having against you. So is tenant harassment allowed? Absolutely not. But it's not the other tenant who is going to be violating the Fair Housing Act. Chances are the property management team has the right to kick that other tenant out of the housing community. So they're still going to get punished. It's just not punished by a court of law because the individual violated the Fair Housing Act. So that's where that.
Quick
Please.
question here on that exact point. So if it is a separate action under the Fair Housing Act, and I also wanted to say sue my landlord for like breach of the lease, right?
Yes.
How would I logistically do that? Do I have to file separate complaints, or I guess just walk me through the process of filing complaint for a breach of the Fair Housing Act?
Okay. Tell you what, I have a couple slides dedicated to that here in a little bit. Can I'll get to it there. Does that work? Okay, yeah, I have some bullet points. I'll go through what it means to file a complaint. But real quick, I will answer, when you file a complaint either with HUD or the Florida Commission on Human Relations or a local fair housing assistance program, it becomes an administrative complaint, which triggers an investigation and can lead to a settlement, not punitive damages, but it can lead to punishment of the actor, an injunction or something like that. It can also lead towards other related damages. So it goes into the line of administrative law. But what's unique to the Fair Housing Act is that you do not have to exhaust administrative procedures prior to filing private action. And we'll talk more about this a little bit later, but you can actually have private action and administrative action happening at the same time. Eventually, you'll have to pick one path, but you can kind of move forward in two arenas at once. But yeah, we'll definitely talk more about that in a little bit. Great question. Okay, so are there any exceptions to fair housing? There's an exception that is often referred to as the Mrs. Murphy Law. Okay, it's an owner-occupied building with no more than 4 units are exempt, meaning you decide that you want to rent out a room in your home. And you do have the right to decide who you want as a roommate. If you prefer, the idea of the Mrs. Murphy Law is that Mrs. Murphy is a little old widow and her husband just passed away and she's left with this big old home to herself. She has the right to say, I would rather just live with another woman. But the moment she advertises a preference, it falls back under fair housing protections. You cannot advertise any sort of discriminatory intent. So the only way she'd be able to, I guess, pull off discriminating is if it was just a friend of hers that she wanted to move in, or word of mouth, something like that. Or maybe she just puts a for rent sign in the yard. It doesn't have any discriminatory language on the for rent sign, but when she makes her decision on who's going to move into that upstairs bedroom, in her mind, she might be discriminating, but she can't advertise the intent to discriminate. Okay. Other exceptions, similarly, if you're a landlord that owns no more than 3 single-family homes, this actually does come up quite a bit. So if you rent to a person who owns 1 single investment property and they use that investment property just as extra income, technically they are exempt from the Fair Housing Act. But again, the moment they advertise any sort of preference, the Fair Housing Act kicks back in. Okay, so it's actually pretty hard to be exempt and stay exempt. You're probably not getting a lot of renters if you're not at least advertising. And then communities that qualify for housing for older persons are allowed to exclude families with children under the age of 18. This is important to remember. In the state of Florida, we have a lot of 55 and older communities, but you have to actually be certified as a 55 and older community. You can't be a neighborhood that has a lot of empty nesters. Our kids grew up, they went off to college, and now we're all in our, later 50s and early 60s. And let's just kind of keep things that way. Let's make a pact as our own little block here and say we're going to do our best to make sure that people that move into this neighborhood or rent some of our investment properties are like us. You can't do that. You actually have to get certified with the state commission to become a 55 and older community. You can't just declare it on your own, okay? So let's talk really quickly about what is a protected class. And by the way, every single one of us here on this call, every single one of us in this country falls into the category of a protected class. It doesn't matter what you are. What matters is that whatever you are, if it's being used against you, that's a violation. So when we talk about race as a protected class, we're talking about your heritage, your bloodline, your identity. Color is specifically your skin color and features. We talk about disability. If you have any sort of disability or incapacitation that affects a major life activity, walking, breathing, seeing, hearing, driving, working, things that affect a major life activity, it qualifies as a disability. When we talk about sex, we talk about gender. And as of just this last February, so we're 6 months into it, sex now includes sexual orientation and gender identity. And it also includes sexual harassment, quid pro quo sexual favors in exchange for rent or being late on your rent or any kind of hostile environment related to sexual harassment. Protected classes include national origin, you or where your family is from. You may be born in the United States and you've never stepped foot in the country that your grandparents come from. But if a landlord is using that against you, you still are protected under the Fair Housing Act. Never been to where my grandparents are from, but if the landlord doesn't like where my grandparents are from, can't use it against me. Religion, that includes any kind of faith, practice, spirituality. A lot of people ask, does religion include agnostic or atheist? Yes, it does. If a landlord notices that Sunday morning all the cars are in the parking lot are gone to church except for yours, and they knock on your door and say, why aren't you at church? That's a violation of the Fair Housing Act. Okay, they have no business asking that question or making you feel uncomfortable for not going to church or going to a different church or having a religion that doesn't have a church at all. And then finally, families with children are a protected class. Minors under the age of 18. You cannot advertise or you cannot say, sorry, this unit's not available to you because you have kids with children. You can say this unit's not available to you because of the size of your family will break code. 2 people per bedroom, that's fine. If you want to move, if you have 4 kids and you're trying to move into a 1-bedroom apartment, that's going to violate the code. But you can't use it, I don't rent to families with children because they mess up the house too much. That's fair housing discrimination. So does protected status protect you from everything? No, and this is actually a really important thing that I have to remind myself and remind phone calls I get. Just because you're a family with children doesn't mean you're exempt from following the lease and the rules of the apartment community. So a family with children can still be evicted for not paying rent. Of course, right now we're under a COVID-related moratorium, but that's more on the rental assistance and eviction. That's not so much about fair housing. But another example, a person from another country can be denied a home loan if they have poor credit history. Or a person with a disability may not get all of the modifications requested if certain requests are not reasonable. So just because you are protected status doesn't mean you just get to kind of walk around willy-nilly and say, I can do whatever I want. No, you still have to follow the rules of your lease or the apartment community. But if a family with children is being evicted because they have children, that's a violation. If a person from another country is being denied a home loan because they're from another country, that's a violation. And if a landlord simply says no or denies a request for modifications because they don't want to deal with that person's disabilities, that's a violation of the Fair Housing Act. So we're going to talk real quickly about disparate impact. And this is extremely important, especially nowadays, based on some of those statistics we saw earlier. When anytime there's a rise in racism, discrimination, hate crimes, disparate impact pops up. Because you have a lot of, I don't want to say a lot, but it's common for fair housing violations to come from those, I guess you could say creative, you could say devious, these kind of policies and schemes that say, I'm not discriminating, but you really are. So disparate impact is when a policy is not discriminatory on its face, but it results negatively on one protected class more than another. So it applies to everyone, but it adversely affects some at a higher rate. And those some all belong to the same protected class. So I'll give you an example. Let's say an apartment community property management team has a rule, a policy that says you cannot rent here unless you have a full-time job. So you have to have a full-time job to qualify for housing. Well, people with disabilities often have part-time jobs. That's just common in the disability community. So this rule would disproportionately deny housing to these populations, okay? And so because disability is a protected class, it would be a violation of the Fair Housing Act. So the rule applies to everyone, but in practice, it has an adverse effect on a specific protected class more than others outside of the protected class. So real quick, keep this in mind. If you walk in and you simply have a part-time job and you say that's unfair, that's discrimination, that's not a protection because part-time job havers is not a protected class. Okay, so technically this rule is fine on its own. You have to have a full-time job to rent here. People with part-time jobs, I'm sorry, that discriminates against you. But part-time job havers is not a protected class. But over time, a year or two down the road, it turns out that you're denying more people with disabilities than any other type of people simply because people with disabilities are more likely to have part-time jobs. Now it's a violation of Fair Housing Act because you're disproportionately affecting people with disabilities. That's why when you see an increase in hate crimes, discrimination, racism, and stuff like that, you have property management communities that are looking for ways to keep out a certain type of class of people or protected status or a vulnerable community. And they do it through these general blanket policies that apply to everybody. But we really know it's going to affect this group more than it does someone else. So you might be having an issue in your housing life where it's not a fair housing violation. It's not discrimination. It's not from a place of racism or something like that. It's just simple poor treatment. But that doesn't mean you have to put up with the poor treatment. There are lots of other laws that protect housing rights. So the Civil Rights Act, Section 1983 is very important when you come to public housing authorities, because public housing authorities are arms of the government. Any kind of civil rights violation will fall under Section 1983 violations. We have county local ordinances, state landlord tenant laws, consumer protection laws, Americans with Disabilities Act, fair lending laws. One thing I do want to point out, I had mentioned earlier that the Federal Fair Housing Act and the Florida Fair Housing Act are very similar to each other. In the state of Florida, we do have certain counties and jurisdictions that do offer more rights. So Alachua County, for example, in addition to the 7 protected rights, they have, I believe, 4 more. It's illegal to discriminate against someone based on a lawful source of income, marital status, immigration status, and they have sexual orientation actually written into the ordinance. Orange County, I believe, have the 7, and I think they have 2 more, marital status, and they also have sexual orientation written into the law itself. So depending on where you're living in Florida, you might actually have more protections. So this is the question we had earlier about filing a complaint. So if you want to take action, you can make an official complaint to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. You can make an official complaint to the Florida Commission on Human Relations. Just a heads up, if you send a complaint to HUD and it is not specific to the federal government violations, like it's not, what am I trying to say here? It's if the state of Florida would also have jurisdiction on that claim, HUD will send it to the Florida Commission on Human Relations. So you may have sent it to HUD, but they're going to forward it to FCHR, because if a lower jurisdiction, or I'm sorry, if a lower body has jurisdiction over that case or that issue, it'll get forwarded to them. Similarly, contact your local fair housing assistance program, contact a legal aid or legal services organization, or contact a private law firm to help represent you in private action. So what is a complaint? A fair housing complaint triggers a government administrative-based investigation into the actions of the offending party. You can file a complaint. You can, the Florida Commission on Human Relations website actually has a downloadable PDF that you can fill in the blanks. My job is to assist people to fill out those complaints, to really do a full, deeper intake, get into the weeds of the details of the discrimination, and kind of do like a first step in understanding: is there standing, is there jurisdiction, is it timely? That falls on me to make sure that the person filing the complaint is going to get to the next step, as opposed to get denied right away because the complaint wasn't ripe yet for action. But once the investigation starts, they reach out to the offending party, and they get moving forward with the investigation based on the details you provided in the complaint. At a certain point during the investigation, they'll pause the investigation and they'll move forward with like a conciliation agreement if you want to. Conciliation is like an early settlement. If you, the aggrieved party, says, I'm fine with you guys stopping the investigation as long as my former landlord, pays me back all the rent I paid all those years, or I get some sort of, monetary benefit to stopping the investigation. That's what happens during the conciliation process. If the conciliation agreement does not come to a conclusion, then they move forward with the investigation again, and it can move all the way to an administrative judge. As I mentioned before, you can start private action. And if you have both private action and an administrative action going on at the same time, the moment the administrative law sets a hearing, you then have to stop your private action or stop your administrative action. You can't have a hearing while you have private action going on at the same time. So basically, you can have two paths moving. Once a hearing is set, you're going to have to say goodbye to one or the other. So if someone believes they may have been the victim of fair housing violation, I'm Florida Legal Services. I have my contact information here at a few more slides. And like I said, we can help you determine if you have a legitimate case or what's a good response or strategy that is best for you. Right here, this is a brochure. When we get done with this conversation tonight, I'm going to email everyone a PDF version of our brochures. These are things that we pass out to families and community members to help them understand their fair housing rights. This brochure talks about landlord-tenant fair housing rights, expectations of landlords, expectations of buying and selling a home, lending. But the goal that I always tell families and communities, it's not your job to memorize the Fair Housing Act. It's your job to just be aware of those red flags we'd like you to kind of keep in mind, so that when something strange does happen in your life related to housing, you know that you can call us and reach out to us and we can help you out. And so that's my contact information. Real quick disclaimer. We are operating under a HUD grant, so our services and operations do come from HUD, but they are not the creators of this content. But that's my contact information, and that was a very fast run through of the Fair Housing Act, and I hope it sparked some questions that we might be able to engage in.
Yeah, hey Joseph, I just had a quick question about, I guess, some of the complaints, if any, that you've seen recently with Asian Americans in the community. What kind of things are they seeing? What are they complaining of? What kind of discrimination are you seeing on a day-to-day basis?
So I'm glad you asked that. One of the things we've noticed in both AAPI community and different national origin-based families is that a lot of these communities are worried about rocking the boat during the CDC moratorium. So as long as they're prevented from being evicted for failure to pay rent, they're not interested in shaking things up because they're on the receiving end of discrimination. So we get these phone calls that we say, hey, you're clearly being discriminated against because you're calling to get your sink fixed and you're the only family that is not getting their sink fixed. They're fixing everybody else's sink but yours. And when you call again, they say something under their breath, COVID blame, something very slur related. And that's when we say that's discrimination. You have every right to have your sink fixed just like everybody else does. And clearly they're using your national origin against you to not do it. But the family responds by saying, I don't want to rock the boat because right now I'm not being evicted. We can't afford rent right now anyways, so I don't want to shake things up. it's really important for families to know that you still have a right to file that complaint. And if they retaliate against you by evicting you because you've moved forward with a complaint, that's a violation of the Fair Housing Act. Landlords, property managers, they cannot retaliate because you exercised your rights. So the types of discrimination we're hearing are those racial slurs. You get a lot of phone calls from people saying, I went and I saw the apartment and suddenly it wasn't available anymore. You know, it was available in the morning when we scheduled for me to come by and see it tonight, but when I showed up, suddenly it wasn't available. So very kind of those, what do you call it? Racism with a smile, you know, kind of a thing where I didn't overtly discriminate against you, but all you had to do was put two and two together to realize that the reason why you didn't get the apartment is because I saw you, and then I moved forward with something else.
That's helpful. And as far, like, if somebody wants to, you know, feels like they're being discriminated against in the housing space, but they don't know to contact legal services or Florida Legal, and they think, hey, let me just go to an attorney instead. I guess for the attorneys on the call, is there some kind of incentive built in the Fair Housing Act that would provide, I don't know, like attorney's fees or something for an attorney who might be interested in taking on these kind of cases to do so?
Yes, absolutely. Both in filing a complaint and going through the administrative process, there are attorney's fees that you can ask for. Damages. Okay, now this gets a little confusing. So if you file it with HUD and HUD keeps it, so it's now in federal court, you can ask for emotional distress damages, and you can tie, you know, attorney's fees and percentages and everything like that. Uh-oh, did I freeze again?
I can hear you.
Okay. If you go through Florida, the FCHR, so Florida has a law that any kind of emotional distress dollars that are assigned to a case must be in front of a jury, which means an administrative law cannot give a judgment on emotional distress dollars. So if your client wants emotional distress, you might want to move forward with private action instead of Florida-based administrative action. At the federal level, yes, administrative, federal, doesn't matter, emotional distress dollars, and those numbers are big. I've done a lot of case law research on this. I've seen things where, you know, the punitive damages, $10,000, the quantitative, you know, real dollars that we can show receipts for, $14,000. Emotional distress, you know, $250,000. I mean, oh yeah, these numbers get really big. Because they're basing it on the concept of the emotional distress you're facing is the stress of not having housing. So anytime someone is faced with homelessness, that's as, you know, I think our courts recognize that as one of the most stressful things you can ever live through. Humiliation, that's a big one. So any type of decision that's made on racism or discrimination, you can attach humiliation to that. I had to go and tell my friends that I couldn't get the apartment because of my national origin, because of my race, because of my religion, or something like that. And you can really go down the list of all the things that qualify as emotional distress, and housing denial is usually going to check off most of those. So those dollars can get pretty high. But again, Florida administration or administrative law can't provide those. So you want private action in front of a jury or a federal administrative law. And yes, you can have attorney's fees attached.
Other than financial remedies that are payable to the party that's being discriminated against and attorney's fees, are there any other types of remedies that are available?
So during that conciliation part of the investigation, when they pause the investigation, that's when they kind of, let's get both parties in the, you know, metaphorical room, and we'll see if we can come to an agreement here. Often that's when a tenant might say, I'm not in this for the money. I just want them to stop this practice. So there can be an injunction on the practice. And a lot of times, in order for a landlord to, you know, conclude this proceeding, they're going to have to go to fair housing training. That's a common, I mean, shouldn't be a punishment. I mean, but you know, if you're the offender, you're going to see that as a punishment. But yeah, some sort of fair housing training and certification. an injunction that you have to get rid of that policy. We talked about disparate impact, where you just have a policy in place and you might not have even meant it to be discriminatory, but because it sat there for so long, it impacted so many people that the courts have decided you need to get rid of that policy. And it needs to be rewritten or written in a way so that it is truly equality as opposed to having this disparate impact later. So yeah, you can have injunctive relief, punitive damages, as well as other related monetary damages. And I'm glad you asked that question, because one of the ways it's not like I'm trying to sell filing a complaint, but a lot of families don't want to move forward. A lot of families just want to stop the discrimination, or what, I'm so sick of this guy and he's discriminating against me, but my lease is up at the end of the month, so I don't really care. It's important for families to know that if you don't file a complaint, then the next family is going to get discriminated just like you did, or they're going to have to put up with this person's treatment just similarly to how you did. And you're going to be protecting your community the more we're willing to file these complaints. Because the truth is, a lot of times, just the moment a landlord or a property management team sees that a complaint was filed, everyone stop what you're doing. Someone filed a discrimination-based complaint against us. Something has to stop, because by the time that we haven't even started doing the investigation, but the fact that one is about to start, people start changing their minds on how they're going to act and treat people. So you might be protecting future families and communities simply by filing the complaint, even if you didn't see it all the way through.
Are there class actions? And if so, is that just for private actions, or would that also fall under some administrative process?
That's a great question. So from my experience and from what I've kind of researched and found, typically class action is going to be identified under that disparate impact. But what gets tricky is that you don't really identify a class of people that then sign their name to it. It's a hard one to answer, because typically you're disproportionately affecting a population of people, not a finite okay, we had this policy in place and it turns out that we turned away 75 people from the same country of origin and everyone else got through. Well, it's not those 75 people that are only able to access the justice. It's everybody that has a similar trait to those 75 people. So can those 75 people have a claim that results in damages? Absolutely. They need to be a part of, I guess that would be more of a class action concept, but fair housing kind of takes a step back even further and says, as much as we're concerned about the 75 people, we're concerned about the thousands of other people that this is going to benefit down the road. So it's kind of like a yes, but from my perspective, it's more of we're worried about the masses as opposed to the finite group. That's a terrible answer, but I think you get what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Okay.
Does the Fair Housing Act currently provide any type of protection for potential tenants who are denied housing because they haven't received the COVID vaccination? And if not, what do you anticipate will happen in the future?
That's a great question. So when you consider fair housing and housing discrimination, you have to look at the elements of the protected class. So is unvaccinated people a protected class? No, it's not written as a separate protected class. But if it turns out that unvaccinated people have a similar trait, and when you have a policy that says you have to be vaccinated before you're allowed to live here, and we have that policy in place, and it turns out that this group of people are more likely to be unvaccinated, and that group is a protected class, now you might have something. But I don't know what those numbers are going to look like in the future, because right now people that are unvaccinated are kind of hitting all the protected classes and different races, different national origin, different belief systems. So I don't know if you're going to find an overwhelming, larger percentage of this group of people versus everyone else who are also unvaccinated.
What if it's something like a zip code? Because I agree, there are so many different religions, so many different races that have, that I guess, connotation for not wanting to be vaccinated, but also by location. So would that be like if they say nobody in this zip code can be?
That's a great question.
Something. I mean, I know that's like
No, but I think that
huge gray area question. That's what I'm asking, because I just want you to struggle a little bit. So.
No problem. Actually, I like that example though, because I think that example would be more likely to become disparate impact. Because as we all know, I don't know if you guys have seen like the red dot mapping, or that shows a different color for every ethnicity where they live in just every city in the country. Blue is, I believe, white. Orange is Hispanic. And each ethnicity has its own color. Everywhere in America, we're segregated. There are very few zip codes that are multi-ethnic, multicultural. So in your example, if you were to say anyone from this zip code is not allowed to rent here, well, residents of zip code 32, XYZ is not a protected class. But because we're such a segregated society, we know that if you live in that zip code, you're more than likely to be of a specific race, color, or ethnicity. And so that would be disparate impact, because if it's a zip code that has a high population of AAPI families, now you got it. That's disparate impact. Absolutely. So you wrote the policy to say, no, we're just discriminating against the zip code. You know what you're doing, right? Yeah.
Just picked one out of my hat for no reason.
No, that's a good one. But you can see how, depending on the example you give, what's going to be more and less likely to be.
Right. Exactly. They picked that zip code for a reason.
Right.
Hey, I think in the beginning, or towards the beginning of the presentation, you were talking about some statistics of relating to discrimination against the AAPI community. And I was wondering, how does that relate to discrimination against other communities? Not that it's necessarily a competition. I was just wanted to know. Yeah, no, let me pull that back up. And I'm glad you asked that. So these are some of those statistics. 9.8% fewer available rental properties were shown to members of AAPI families than their white counterparts, who were shown 6.6%. It's like when you do testing and stuff like that, ultimately what we're getting at, I'll go to this slide. There's that bullet point under model minority where it says it creates a divide against other minority populations. There has been research that shows that when discriminatory intended landlords and property managers plan to discriminate against all non-white people, they're going to discriminate less against AAPI families than other minority families. What that does is it creates a divide amongst those minority populations, saying, we're all treated worse than white people are, but you all get treated better than we do. So now we're also upset with you. And so it kind of, it creates that, well, we don't want to rock the boat because we don't want to get discriminated more, but we also don't want to be recognized as a community that is standing in the way of someone else's equality and rights. Mm-hmm. So in my opinion, and I think the research I've read kind of agrees with me, or, it's probably me agreeing with it, is that it puts a lot of families in the AAPI community into a rock and a hard place. We don't want to be discriminated more, but we also don't want to be the reason for other people's discrimination. So yeah, is that kind of answer what you're looking at? Yeah. I don't know if anyone else has questions. I just have one more. Yeah. Again, I appreciate your time. So I guess for anyone else who might view this, who's interested in knowing what the process through the administrative route looks like. So say I feel like I'm being discriminated against, I come to Florida Legal and I say, help me out, right? How, between the intake process and kind of the end, what does the average lifespan of that process look like? I understand there's a conciliatory, process, mediation, what have you. But on average, how long does it take for things to play out? So that's a great question. So this contact information I have up, and I'll put it back up here. All right, so that is that phone number.
that phone number rings my cell phone. Like it goes straight to me, and that email address goes straight to me. So as far as getting in touch with me, it's very fast. I like to do intakes right away, maybe kind of like a mini intake as far as, what's your story? Do you have enough in the initial steps to actually have an idea of what we're talking about? If the answer is yes, I'll plan something maybe just a couple days later in the week or maybe sometime the following week. Let's do a full intake. We'll schedule an hour of our time on the phone. I'm going to ask you a lot of questions about your situation, your history at this place with the landlord or something like that. And if they agree that they want to move forward with a complaint, I'm doing that intake driven by what I know the complaint questions are. So by the time I'm done with that intake, I can take their answers and, apply it to the complaint form, which allows for a couple pages of, additional notes and addendum and stuff like that. So even if you have more information than the complaint asks for, you can still provide it. Once you file the complaint, they have, I believe it's, I'm going to get this wrong. I want to say it's 20 days. It's a few weeks to contact you, the aggrieved party, the future complainant. What happens then is that technically what you've submitted is a request for a complaint or an application for complaint. It's not a complaint yet. They then perfect the complaint. They read what you sent. They call the individual and say, we have this document that you sent us. I'm going to review it with you. We're going to kind of perfect it. And then we're going to send it back to you for signature. And once the individual signs it and sends it back, now it's an official complaint. At this point, it triggers contacting the respondent party, assigning an investigator. And within the first 100 days, everything is supposed to be moving forward. But usually within that first 100 days, the investigation has already begun and maybe they've already paused for conciliation. It depends on how far you're going to end up going. If you go all the way to an administrative judge and a hearing and a final judgment in front of an administrative judge, a year and a half, maybe 2 years. But if you stop at conciliation, you could be done 2-3 months into it. What that means is that a lot of times families are calling wanting emergency relief or immediate relief. As far as fair housing immediate relief goes, at the federal level, you can file like emergency petition to say, in addition to filing this complaint, we want you to prevent our client from being evicted or put an immediate temporary injunction on this treatment while we sort out the complaint and the investigation. That is available. But again, you're not going down to your county court for the injunction. You're submitting something to HUD at the federal level or something like that. So you are looking at time. A lot of times by the time you are settled, if you see it all the way through, you have moved on. You're probably living somewhere else. And this is going to be something in the future where the damages or the settlement that you come to is going to meet you in the future, as opposed to remedy the current situation that might need immediate relief. But again, I've never seen anyone on the receiving end of damages say, I don't like this. Whenever it comes, you're happy it came, and it's always going to be a good point in your life. But HUD and FCHR, they do have certain benchmarks that they're supposed to meet: 20 days, 100 days, where the investigation is moving forward and they're reaching out to you. Yeah, that's
okay.
The best thing we have. Yeah.
I know Shally's on here, Vanessa and Melissa with the NAACP. I don't know if you all had any questions that you wanted to ask Joseph.
Yeah, I just want to say hi again for my introduction. This is Shally. I was actually drove home with my husband from the mayor's office. We just have the 150 press conference done. So they sent a little presentation to all the media. So I was just cannot be seen, but very Joseph, I just want to say great presentation, because when I first see Kenway put up this conference, I was asking myself what kind of question I have, because I serve a lot of AAPI community, particularly immigrants too. So they are not coming from a country that they know they're right. I think most of the time that they just don't know they're being discriminated. So I think education is very important. And also I learned a lot. I was thinking about rental only, but then you are talking about the appraiser, appraisal report, and I wouldn't think about that. I mean, but if you have that kind of curious, I mean, what can you tell that you being discriminated? So you have to get another appraisal done? Is that what you suggesting?
Yeah, I mean, that would be kind of an official way to prove, hey, this first appraisal came back low, and then I did my own test. I did my own version of what a experiment and control would look like. But what I always tell families or communities when I give these presentations is, the moment something feels weird or a red flag pops into your head, and you learn that from the brochures we pass out or the presentations I've delivered, that's when I want to hear from you. I don't want to hear from you when you have pages of your own investigation and statistics. I want to hear from you the moment you think something odd is happening, because I'll help you flesh out whether or not this is discrimination. And if we don't have the evidence we need, we can find an organization that can do a little bit of enforcement and testing. We have partner organizations throughout the state, throughout Mid-Florida, Community Services Mid-Florida. Community Legal Services Mid-Florida, they do testing. We have a great partnership with them. We're looking to expand our operations. So if there is a situation that someone comes to us and says, I have a red flag for you, that's when we want to know.
That's very good. I will probably use your information if Kenway can share more about that. I will usually share with my community. I serve a lot of different ones, like Islamic community too. I work with them closely. So I think they definitely can use some of the information that you have. And now that we know that we can contact you, that will be great.
Yeah.
Great, educational, for that. Yeah.
I'm happy to hear you say that, because I can't do my job without partners and collaborative efforts. So if there's anything we can take from this conversation where we get to keep this conversation moving and work together in the future, even if it's just as simple as referrals and stuff like that, that's a big deal for me. If we can set up future conversations or do some community outreach together, I love that. That's what I'm here for. And I want to piggyback on what you said before. A lot of times families don't know that they have the rights or when the right is being violated. When I give presentations to new home buyer classes, they're all looking at me like, why would we have a fair housing conversation? We're new home buyers. We're done with that. That part of our life is behind us. No, you are always susceptible to housing discrimination. And I guess the only time maybe not is when you paid for your home free and clear, and you live in a neighborhood without a homeowners association. But honestly, even then, property taxes could still be discriminatory. So you're never clear from violations of your rights.
Do you guys have the bandwidth to investigate every single claim, or are there ever instances where you just said, hey, we're too busy, we're at capacity, or else?
So far, so good. Every call we've gotten, we've been able to respond to. Like I said, a lot of times the calls come in and there's not discrimination. It really is just landlord-tenant law violation. That's when we look for a referral, because my work really is specific to fair housing. But as far as those fair housing violations, every inquiry that's come to us, we've been able to, give it the attention it needs, whether they decided to move forward with a complaint or they decided to, just kind of take an understanding of what rights are available to them and make their own decision. A lot of times families just take a little bit of one-on-one education and awareness, and they themselves take it to the landlord and say, I'm aware of my rights now, and you can't do what you're doing. Sometimes that's all it takes. So, yeah.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah. Any other questions, thoughts?
Hi, this is Vanessa from the NAACP of Orange County, Florida. I just wanted to say thank you so much for hosting this. As somebody of South Asian descent of myself, that the first couple of slides are definitely really validating. I haven't seen a presentation like this before, so thank you very much for having it. And I definitely will keep the contact information to refer to people. Thanks again.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks so much for joining us. And yeah, let me know whenever I can help down the road. Absolutely.
Just one quick general question, but do you have people who can speak other languages at Florida Legal Services?
Great question. I'm glad you asked that, and I'm glad we didn't end this without that conversation. So right now, We have Spanish speakers. We have Haitian Creole speaker on staff. Outside of that, on staff, we don't, but we do have access to like interpretation services. That is definitely something that we have at our fingertips, just not on staff. One of the things that I'm always looking for, especially when our new round of funding comes, hopefully in the in the next month or two, and we get to expand our program, I would love to translate our brochures into as many languages as possible. So if that's
my next thing is
okay.
Brochures and languages that I could leave, like at the Asian markets around here, or because like Shally was saying, I don't think people realize that they have even rights.
Yeah, you'll see we made this brochure. It's more culturally appropriate for AAPI families, but it's in English. So right now we have brochures in Spanish, Haitian Creole, English, and then we have our English brochures that just kind of reflect different families, different family sizes, different ethnicities, national origins. But I would jump at the opportunity to have these translated into more language.
Get them, be sure to shoot us a copy because I'd be happy to hand them out. So.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to hold you to that. No, thank you. Thank you. That's good to know. Thank you. Any other questions, thoughts? Any advice for me in my community outreach into communities, AAPI communities?
I can't think of anything right now, but I have your information. So
okay.
Believe me, it is going to get distributed, and hopefully, you don't have too many sleepless. your phone's just going off. It's dangerous putting your phone number on a PowerPoint slide.
Well,
technically, about the bandwidth, he's going to put you to the tab.
Well, like I said, that number does ring my cell phone, but it is a work number. It just goes to an app that also hits my cell phone.
Your clock, whatever.
Yeah, no, I honestly, I really hope it does, because like I said, even a high volume of calls doesn't necessarily result in a high number of complaints filed. It really does kind of filter its way down. If I get 100 calls in a month, only 4 or 5 of those might actually result in moving forward with complaints, because so many of those calls either weren't fair housing based, but they still got to have a conversation with an attorney about, certain rights, or maybe they were fair housing rights, but they're just not at a place in their lives right now where they want to move forward with a complaint. So it definitely filters its way down. So I don't mind a high number of calls. Yeah.
Thank you, Joseph.
Yeah, of course.
I don't think we have anything further, but thank you so much for presenting. We really appreciate it.
No problem.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much for attending. I look forward to speaking with you again down the road, exchanging emails. And when I'm done here, I'm going to send everybody an email with an electronic version of our brochure. So please pass those out. And if you have a good network that you do pass them out to, let me know who you sent those to, and because I like tracking where our information goes. So that's helpful to me. Thank you.
Will do. Thank you so much.
All right. Have a wonderful evening, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.